Don't forget to comment below and let us know your thoughts on the Kinahan family's rise and fall. Hit like if you find this true crime documentary captivating, and make sure to subscribe for more in-depth stories like this. Now, let's dive into the story. In the heart of Dublin, Christy Kinahan's story began not with a grand entrance, but with the quiet determination of a boy who saw the world differently. Born into a working-class family in the 1950s, Christy wasn't like the other children in his neighborhood. While most of them were running through the streets playing games, Christy was watching, observing, learning how the world worked, not through the lens of fists or bullets, but through strategy, calculation, and subtle manipulation. Christy wasn't drawn to the immediate chaos of the streets. He was more intrigued by the way people moved behind the scenes. He saw the power that came from avoiding the limelight, from staying out of sight while others scrambled for control. As a young boy, he learned how to speak in a way that commanded respect, to walk with a quiet confidence that suggested he knew more than he let on. He wasn't looking to be a street thug or a violent figure in Dublin's underworld. He was looking to build something different, a quiet empire that no one could touch. The first few years of his adult life were spent testing the waters, dabbling in small-time scams, forging checks, and learning the ropes of the criminal world. These minor offenses didn't make headlines, but they gave Christy something more valuable: experience. He learned how to move money without being noticed, how to use the system to his advantage, and most importantly, how to stay invisible while building a network that would serve him for years to come. It was in the late 1970s, as the heroin trade began to take root in Europe, that Christy's real transformation began. The streets of Dublin were changing, and so was the way organized crime worked. But where others saw violence and chaos, Christy saw opportunity. Instead of being drawn into street-level deals, he sought out the higher echelons of the trade, the logistics, the distribution, and the networks that moved drugs across borders. Christy wasn't interested in dealing on the streets. He wanted to control the entire operation from behind the scenes. It was a quiet power, the kind of power that didn't attract attention but commanded respect. By the mid-1980s, Christy was already well established in the global drug trade, having built relationships with key players across Europe. But it wasn't just about selling drugs. Christy was building something much bigger, an international empire, one that would move products, money, and people without ever being noticed. He used his mind, not his fists, to dominate the game. While other criminal leaders fought with guns and knives, Christy relied on his ability to stay out of the spotlight, his patience, and his methodical approach to operations. In 1986, Christy was arrested for a minor drug charge. It wasn't the first time he had run afoul of the law, but it marked the first moment when people began to take notice of him. The authorities had always seen him as just another small-time crook, but his calm demeanor during the arrest, his calculated movements, and his ability to stay cool under pressure began to raise questions. This wasn't the behavior of an ordinary criminal, it was the behavior of a man who was in control. Even as he sat in prison, awaiting trial, Christy's mind was never far from his empire. He used the time to reflect, to strategize, and to lay the foundation for his next moves. Prison wasn't a punishment for Christy, it was a learning opportunity. He studied the operations of other criminals, observed the methods used by law enforcement, and planned his next steps. He knew that when he got out, he would have to be even more careful, even more discreet. And so, when the time came, he disappeared, not just physically, but from the public eye. Christy Kinahan had become a ghost, a name whispered in criminal circles but never seen, never caught. As Christy Kinahan spent time in prison, he was far from idle. While many criminals would have drowned in the despair of confinement, Christy's mind was always calculating, always planning. It was during these years that he started to truly understand the inner workings of the criminal world, how empires were built not with force, but with foresight. It was his time in prison that would lay the foundation for what would become one of the most elusive and dangerous criminal operations in Europe. In the early 1990s, after serving his time, Christy re-emerged in Amsterdam, a city that would soon become the heart of his operations. But unlike the brash criminals who loudly proclaimed their power, Christy had a different approach. He wasn't about drawing attention to himself. He was about control, power from behind the scenes. Amsterdam, known for its bustling trade and international connections, was the perfect place for Christy to operate in the shadows. It wasn't about selling heroin on the streets, it was about controlling the entire trade, from the factories that produced it to the distribution networks that moved it across Europe. Christy didn't need to surround himself with a gang of rowdy thugs. He wasn't interested in being the loudest man in the room. What made Christy different was his quiet intelligence. He built a network of professionals, logistical experts, financiers, and businessmen who operated in the shadows of his empire. These men didn't know the whole story, but they understood the game. Christy knew that the key to his success wasn't brute force or intimidation. It was about understanding the systems, how money flowed, how goods moved, how law enforcement thought. He didn't just want to be part of the drug trade, he wanted to control it from the top down. Over the next decade, Christy's influence spread across Europe. His network expanded to countries where law enforcement was lax or corrupt, where the authorities didn't ask questions about the origins of money or goods. By the late 1990s, Christy's empire had moved beyond Amsterdam. He had connections in South America, the Middle East, and even Asia. Christy wasn't just a drug dealer, he was a global businessman, operating with the precision of a corporation and the secrecy of a ghost. But this wasn't the world of flashy drug lords, where every street corner was a battleground. Christy's empire was built on silence and precision. His shipments weren't sent out with a bang, they were quiet, hidden behind false paperwork, disguised as legitimate goods. When law enforcement or rival criminals came looking, they found nothing but a well-oiled machine that operated in plain sight. Christy was everywhere, but he was nowhere at the same time. His ability to avoid attention was legendary. He never took the spotlight, he never made a public appearance that could tie him to anything illegal. Christy Kinahan became a name whispered in the underworld, a ghost who controlled a multi-million-dollar empire without ever being seen. His empire wasn't just a criminal operation, it was a system, a network of loyal men who never questioned orders and operated with precision. They weren't violent street thugs, they were professionals. Each of them played their part, and Christy was the mastermind who orchestrated it all. But as his empire grew, so did the risks. Christy knew that the larger his operations became, the harder it would be to remain in the shadows. The law was closing in, but Christy had always been one step ahead. He was a master of misdirection, of creating false trails, of shifting the focus away from himself. He understood that power was about being invisible, not just in public, but in every aspect of his operation. And for years, it worked. However, Christy's empire wasn't just about money or drugs, it was about legacy. He had built something that could withstand the scrutiny of the law, the violence of rival gangs, and the dangers that came with being at the top of the criminal world. Christy wasn't just a fleeting figure, he was creating a dynasty, one that would outlive him. His sons, Daniel and Christopher Jr., were being groomed for this world from an early age, but they weren't ready to take over yet. Christy wasn't about to hand over the reins of his empire until he knew they were prepared. And so, Christy continued his work from the shadows, expanding his empire, building his network, and making sure that his name would never be tied to the operation. He was the ghost kingpin, never seen, never caught, and always in control. The empire was his legacy, and he would ensure that it lasted long after he was gone. By the late 1990s, Christy Kinahan's empire had reached unprecedented heights. His grip on Europe's drug trade was undeniable. The logistics were flawless, the money flowed through an intricate network of businesses, and Christy had remained a ghost, his name whispered in criminal circles, but his face never seen. Yet, as his empire grew, so did the realization that nothing lasts forever. The time would come when the empire would need new leadership, and Christy knew it. He had two sons, Daniel and Christopher Jr. The brothers had been raised in the shadows, aware of their father's work but never fully immersed in the gritty realities of it. They saw the wealth, the power, the control, but their childhoods had been far from ordinary. Their father's empire was built not just on silence, but on trust, and Christy had carefully placed the right people in the right positions to run the operation while he remained behind the scenes. For years, Christy had been preparing his sons, training them to take the reins when the time came. Daniel, the older of the two, had always shown a natural charisma, a gift for dealing with people and building relationships. Christopher Jr., on the other hand, was more reserved, with a sharp mind for details, logistics, and the invisible systems that kept the empire running smoothly. Where Daniel had the public-facing skills, Christopher Jr. was the quiet architect of the empire's infrastructure. Christy knew that between them, they had the balance of leadership his empire needed. But the transition wouldn't be easy. Christy had always been the kingpin, the one who kept everything running from the shadows. The brothers had grown up in his world, but they had never had to step into the spotlight until now. And as the years passed, and the empire continued to grow, it became clear that it was no longer a matter of whether Christy would step aside, it was when. In the early 2000s, law enforcement began to take a closer look at the Kinahan network. The years of keeping a low profile were catching up. Global intelligence was improving, and the world was becoming more interconnected. But Christy was always a step ahead. He had learned long ago that staying in the shadows wasn't enough. His operations were vast, but they were also intricate. He had systems in place to hide shipments, launder money, and move product across borders without detection. Now, it was time for his sons to step up. For Daniel, the public-facing part of the empire had always been his territory. He had spent time in the legitimate world, growing their businesses, cultivating relationships with the wealthy and powerful. His position in boxing had given him connections with legitimate figures in the sports world, but his involvement also brought new risks. Daniel's rise was not just about running a criminal empire, it was about maintaining the facade of legitimacy. He worked with politicians, businessmen, and celebrities, anything to keep the Kinahan name from being directly linked to illegal activity. Christopher Jr., on the other hand, had stayed mostly in the background, focusing on the internal workings of the empire. He had inherited his father's cold, calculating mindset. While Daniel worked the public image, Christopher Jr. controlled the logistics, the supply chains, the financial systems, and the connections that moved products across continents. He had become the silent operator, just like his father before him, ensuring that the empire ran smoothly and that nothing was left to chance. But now, the empire was growing too large for anyone to manage without drawing attention. As Daniel and Christopher Jr. took on more responsibility, the stakes grew higher. Rival cartels were becoming more aggressive, trying to establish footholds in markets that the Kinahans had once controlled exclusively. The digital age had opened up new opportunities for crime, but it also brought new vulnerabilities. Law enforcement agencies, now more connected than ever, began sharing intelligence in real time, and the heat on the Kinahan organization was rising. The brothers were beginning to realize that their father's methods, while effective for a time, were no longer enough. The empire that Christy had built was like a well-oiled machine, but the world was changing. Technology was evolving faster than anyone could have predicted. The authorities were becoming smarter, more efficient. Christy had kept his operations hidden by blending into the background, but now, Daniel and Christopher Jr. were faced with the challenge of keeping the empire alive in a world where secrets were harder to keep. They couldn't operate as they once had. The old ways of silence and shadows weren't enough. They had to adapt. But as they worked to modernize the empire and adjust to the new world order, they faced new challenges. The brothers were not only battling rival organizations and law enforcement, they were also fighting within their own ranks. Betrayals, disloyalty, and personal rivalries started to surface as the pressure mounted. Trust was becoming a rare commodity in their world, and the empire that Christy had built on loyalty was beginning to crack. But Christy had prepared them for this. He had built his empire with a solid foundation, one that was not just about drugs or money, but about systems and people. He had taught his sons that power came not from violence, but from control over systems, people, and information. As Daniel and Christopher Jr. navigated the challenges of running the Kinahan empire, they had one thing that no one else had: the legacy of Christy Kinahan, the ghost kingpin who had built an empire on silence and strategy. Now, it was up to them to keep the empire alive. and they knew that their survival would depend on more than just avoiding detection. It would require innovation, ruthlessness, and, above all, adaptability. Christy had shown them the way. It was time for them to step into the light and redefine what it meant to be the rulers of this new world. As the Kinahan Empire entered the mid-2000s, Daniel and Christopher Jr. found themselves at a crossroads. The world they had inherited was rapidly changing, and so were the pressures that came with leading a criminal network of such magnitude. Christy had built his empire with patience and strategic silence, but now the brothers had to face the mounting weight of being both public figures and the hidden hands behind one of Europe's most powerful criminal organizations. Daniel, the more charismatic of the two, had embraced the public-facing role of the Kinahan family. His involvement in the boxing world, although legitimate on the surface, had brought new risks. His increasing visibility in mainstream media meant that the Kinahan name was becoming synonymous with not only criminal activity but also a legitimate public presence. The higher Daniel rose, the more attention he attracted, and with attention came scrutiny. His public persona had to be carefully crafted. He was a businessman, a philanthropist, a boxing promoter, but behind the polished smile and well-tailored suits, Daniel was still running a vast criminal enterprise. Law enforcement was starting to put pieces together, drawing links between his legitimate endeavors and the shadowy dealings of the Kinahan Empire. Daniel was careful not to overstep, to make sure the lines between his public image and the illegal world he controlled were blurred enough to keep him out of reach, but every step he took on the world stage came with more danger. Rivals began to see him as a figurehead, a threat to their own operations, and Daniel knew the more visible he became, the more likely he was to be targeted. Christopher Jr., on the other hand, thrived in the shadows. His mind for systems and logistics had made him the backbone of the operation. He understood how money moved, how product flowed, and how to keep the empire hidden in plain sight. While Daniel dealt with the ever-growing pressures of maintaining a public image, Christopher Jr. continued to expand the empire's digital infrastructure. He had spent years perfecting a network that could move millions of dollars in cash without ever leaving a trace. With the rise of cryptocurrency, Christopher saw new possibilities for laundering money, an untraceable, invisible currency that allowed the Kinahans to operate even more effectively. Yet, no matter how careful the brothers were, the cracks in their empire were beginning to show. Rivals, both from within their own ranks and from outside, started making moves against them. The Kinahans had grown too powerful, too influential, and there were others in the criminal world who wanted to claim their position. The likes of the Russian Mafia, the Albanian cartels, and other European gangs had taken notice of the Kinahans' rising influence, and they weren't about to let it go unchallenged. As the brothers worked to secure their empire, internal issues started to bubble to the surface. The pressure to maintain control, to keep things running smoothly, was straining their relationship. Where once they had operated as a united front, the weight of power and responsibility now created subtle fractures between them. Christopher Jr.'s silent, strategic mind sometimes clashed with Daniel's more public-facing approach, and the stress of managing the empire began to test their bond. Old associates started to question their loyalty, and whispers of betrayal began to surface. Some of Christy's original allies, those who had helped build the empire, started to feel sidelined by the brothers' new approach. They wanted a bigger share of the profits, more influence in the decision-making processes, and some began to question the direction in which the empire was headed. But it wasn't just the internal power struggles that were a threat, it was the law. As the digital age progressed, law enforcement agencies were becoming increasingly sophisticated. Intelligence sharing between countries had become more effective, and technology was now an ever-present tool in their fight against organized crime. The Kinahans had always been ahead of the game, but the law was catching up. Christy's careful methods of evading capture were beginning to lose their effectiveness. Even though Christopher Jr. had created an untraceable system for their operations, the law was evolving, learning, and adapting at an alarming rate. The heat was on, and the brothers knew they couldn't afford any mistakes. Despite these growing threats, Daniel and Christopher Jr. continued to adapt. They expanded their empire further, reaching into more distant parts of the world, Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. The Kinahan name was becoming more well-known, and as it did, so did the dangers that came with it. They couldn't hide in the shadows forever. Rival cartels were beginning to challenge the Kinahans, trying to carve out their own territory. The tension was palpable, and for the first time in years, the brothers realized that the empire Christy had built could no longer be ruled with silence alone. The world was changing, and the old methods weren't enough. They would need to be more strategic, more aggressive, and even more ruthless than before. Christopher Jr. began to push the digital aspect of the empire even further, creating new networks that were virtually untraceable, even by the most advanced surveillance technologies. But even the best systems had weaknesses, and the more the Kinahans expanded, the more exposed they became. The empire that Christy had so carefully built was now under threat not just from external enemies but from the inner workings of their own operation. The question wasn't if they could hold on to the empire, it was whether they could survive long enough to keep it intact. Despite the mounting challenges, one thing was clear: the Kinahans weren't going down without a fight. The legacy that Christy had built would not be easily undone. But as the heat from law enforcement and rivals alike grew more intense, the brothers realized that the next chapter in their empire's story would be the hardest yet. Survival was no longer guaranteed. Adaptation was no longer optional. The Kinahans were facing their most dangerous enemies yet: time and their own hubris. By 2010, the Kinahan Empire, once a shadow in the criminal world, had become an undeniable force. But with power came scrutiny, and with success came exposure. The brothers, Daniel and Christopher Jr., had fought to keep their father's legacy alive, expanding the empire, adapting to new technologies, and balancing public visibility with covert criminal operations. But as the empire grew, so did the risks. The heat from law enforcement was no longer a distant threat, it was at their doorstep. Christy had built his empire on silence, patience, and strategy. He had outwitted rivals and authorities for decades by operating from the shadows, never once putting himself in a position where he could be directly tied to the operation. But the world had changed. Information now traveled at the speed of light, and even the best-laid plans had their vulnerabilities. Christy had been the ghost Kingpin, the man who controlled an empire without ever being seen. But now, that ghost was starting to fade. The digital landscape was more transparent, and the very systems Christy had built to keep his operations hidden were being tested by a new breed of law enforcement. Daniel, once the face of the empire, had risen to prominence in the boxing world. His involvement in legitimate businesses, real estate, sports promotions, and more, gave the Kinahans a facade of respectability. But the more Daniel was exposed to the public eye, the more law enforcement focused on him. The connections between his legitimate ventures and the underworld were becoming too obvious to ignore. Despite his efforts to keep his criminal activities in the shadows, Daniel knew the longer he operated in the public eye, the more likely he was to be exposed. Christopher Jr., on the other hand, had kept a low profile, continuing to focus on the inner workings of the empire. His expertise in logistics, systems, and digital infrastructure had allowed the Kinahans to stay one step ahead of law enforcement for years. But even his meticulous systems were beginning to show signs of stress. Law enforcement agencies had become more sophisticated in their approach. They were no longer relying solely on informants and surveillance. Now, they were using technology to track the movement of money, goods, and people in ways that Christie's empire had never anticipated. As the pressure mounted, both Daniel and Christopher Jr. knew they couldn't keep the empire hidden forever. The external threats were growing, and their own people were starting to feel the strain. Some of Christie's oldest associates, men who had helped build the empire from the ground up, were beginning to question their loyalty. There were whispers of betrayal in the air, of people looking to cash out, of men who had served Christie for years now seeing the empire as a liability rather than a legacy. In the world of organized crime, loyalty was fragile, and the empire's foundations were starting to crack. The competition from rival cartels was becoming more aggressive. The Albanian Mafia, the Russians, and new emerging factions were all vying for control of the same markets the Kinahans had once dominated. These rivals were more ruthless, more willing to resort to violence than Christy had ever been. They saw the Kinahans as a soft target, an empire built on silence rather than force. The game had changed, and for the first time, the Kinahans found themselves facing an enemy that wasn't interested in negotiating. They wanted blood. The stakes were higher than ever, and as the walls closed in, the brothers knew they would have to make a choice. They couldn't afford to wait any longer. Their father had always taught them to stay a step ahead, to be patient, but now time was running out. Law enforcement was closing in on the Kinahan network, and it was only a matter of time before someone, an informant, a rival, or even an insider, would expose the empire for what it was. Christopher Jr., ever the strategist, began looking for ways to move their operations beyond Europe. He had always known that in this game, survival wasn't just about staying hidden, it was about expanding and diversifying. They needed new territories, new markets, and new routes that were outside the reach of the law. But as they expanded into Africa and the Middle East, the threats became more complex. Local factions, governments, and corrupt officials made it difficult to maintain the quiet, invisible operations they had once relied on. Daniel, too, began to consider a different path. He had long been the public face of the empire, but he could see that the game was changing. The more they tried to maintain a public image of legitimacy, the more they exposed themselves to scrutiny. It was time to pull back. They needed to lay low, to disappear, to let the storm pass. But with their empire spread across the globe, disappearing wasn't as simple as it had once been. They couldn't just vanish into the shadows like their father had. The pressure of leading the empire was taking its toll on both brothers. The weight of Christy's legacy, of keeping the empire intact, was crushing. Christy had built it all on silence, but now, as the brothers tried to steer the empire through modern challenges, they realized that survival would require more than just staying out of the spotlight. They would have to outthink their rivals, outmaneuver law enforcement, and adapt to a world that was increasingly difficult to hide from. And so, as the empire's enemies closed in and the brothers faced the toughest challenges of their careers, they made a choice, one that would define the future of the Kinahan family. They couldn't afford to wait any longer. It was time to make a move. But the question remained, would it be enough to save their empire, or would the Kinahans, like so many before them, fall victim to the weight of their own ambition? By 2015, the once invisible Kinahan Empire had become a global presence. But its rise had not been without consequence. As the empire expanded across continents, from the streets of Dublin to the illicit trade routes of the Middle East and Africa, the Kinahans found themselves increasingly exposed. They were no longer the shadows in the corners of the world, they were the central players in a high-stakes game that demanded constant adaptation and, more than ever, constant vigilance. Daniel, ever the public figure, had reached a point where the weight of his visibility became impossible to ignore. His involvement in boxing, real estate, and various other legitimate businesses had been both a blessing and a curse. While it allowed the Kinahans to operate behind the guise of respectability, it also meant that Daniel was now a target for law enforcement, rivals, and even his own associates who were looking to take advantage of his growing prominence. The once subtle ties between his legitimate enterprises and his criminal empire had become too apparent. The heat was rising, and it was only a matter of time before his public image collided with the truth of his criminal dealings. Christopher Jr., who had stayed in the shadows for most of his career, was no longer content with merely maintaining the digital and logistical infrastructure of the empire. His brilliant mind had always been the backbone of the Kinahan operation, but now, faced with the growing threat of exposure, he realized that even his carefully constructed digital fortresses were not foolproof. As technology advanced, law enforcement agencies had begun to use sophisticated surveillance techniques that could track even the most encrypted communications. His digital operations, once untouchable, were now vulnerable to an ever-advancing enemy. Rival cartels, sensing the vulnerability of the Kinahans, began to close in. The Albanians, the Russians, and newer factions from South America and the Middle East saw the Kinahans as a formidable adversary, but also as an empire that was ripe for taking. In the world of organized crime, power was everything, and the Kinahans had become a target for those who wanted to inherit their position at the top. Internally, the cracks in the empire began to widen. As pressure mounted from external forces, the loyalty of Christy's original allies started to falter. Some of the old guard, men who had built the empire with Christy from the ground up, began to question the brothers' leadership. The stress of running such a massive operation, combined with the growing internal conflict, began to strain the very foundation Christy had built. People were no longer afraid of the Kinahans, they were starting to question them, and in the world of crime, doubt was the deadliest weapon. As Daniel and Christopher Jr. tried to hold everything together, the situation reached a tipping point. Law enforcement across Europe had become increasingly sophisticated, working together more efficiently than ever before. They had finally connected the dots: the lavish lifestyle, the political connections, the questionable financial transactions. They all pointed to the Kinahans. With every passing day, the evidence grew more damning. The police had spent years building cases, watching, listening, and tracking every move, and now they were ready to make their move. But the brothers weren't going to go down without a fight. They had learned from Christy, who had always been one step ahead of the law. They knew they had to move fast, to secure their assets and protect what they had built. Christopher Jr. immediately began to shift the digital infrastructure, making it harder for law enforcement to trace the flow of money and drugs. He leveraged cryptocurrencies and encrypted communication channels, hoping to create new pathways that could keep them hidden from the authorities. But as their digital walls strengthened, so did the pressure to act. The physical side of the empire also required attention. Daniel began to move assets into safer locations, shifting properties and investments into countries where law enforcement had less reach. The family began to prepare for what was looking more and more like an inevitable collapse. But even in their preparation, there was a sense of desperation. For years, they had operated in the shadows, building a vast, intricate network. But now, as the walls closed in, they knew the time for hiding was over. In the midst of all this, old enemies began to resurface. The Mafia families in Italy, the cartel leaders in Spain, and the corrupt officials in Africa, all of them saw an opportunity in the Kinahans' vulnerability. But the Kinahan brothers were not about to be overtaken. As the pressure mounted from all sides, they made a decision: it was time to fight back. They began to work in secret, making alliances with former enemies, playing rival factions against each other, and consolidating their power wherever they could. But even as the brothers rallied their forces, they knew that survival was no longer guaranteed. The empire Christy had built with such precision was crumbling, and they could feel it. Law enforcement was closing in, their rivals were growing bolder, and their own people were starting to turn on them. The Kinahan legacy, once untouchable, was now in jeopardy. With every move they made, they were running out of time. The question wasn't if they could survive, it was whether they would be able to adapt fast enough to hold on to the empire they had inherited, or if they would become just another story of criminal downfall, buried by time and rivals. The tension in the Kinahan camp was palpable. By 2017, Daniel and Christopher Jr. had reached the breaking point. The walls had closed in. The law was relentless, rivals were taking their shots, and the empire that Christy Kinahan had carefully built was now under siege from every side. The brothers had done everything they could to stay ahead, shifting assets, covering their tracks, and adapting to a digital world that seemed to grow more hostile with each passing day. But the cost of survival was starting to show. The pressure was more than just external. It was beginning to erode the very foundation of their family. Christopher Jr. had always been the mind behind the empire's digital infrastructure, but even his systems were beginning to buckle under the strain. The sophistication of law enforcement had reached new levels, and no amount of encryption or digital manipulation could guarantee their safety anymore. Christopher Jr. had been preparing for this moment for years. He had always known that the digital landscape would be their biggest threat, but the complexity of the operation had finally caught up with him. The Kinahans had outgrown their ability to remain hidden. And then, as if things weren't complicated enough, betrayal entered the equation. Christy's original allies, the men who had helped him rise to power, began to turn on his sons. The pressures of maintaining the empire had fractured the once loyal ranks. Old friendships were tested, and some men, once bound by loyalty and trust, began to see the Kinahans as a sinking ship. One by one, they began leaking information, providing law enforcement with the very details they needed to unravel the operation. The cracks within the Kinahan ranks were becoming chasms. Those who had once been trusted operatives were now viewed with suspicion. Christopher Jr. and Daniel began questioning everyone around them. Who could they trust? Who was working against them? Every meeting, every transaction, every whisper became a potential threat. They had to assume that anyone could be an informant. The empire that Christy had built on loyalty and trust was now hanging by a thread, and the only thing holding it together was the shared fear of what would happen if it all came crashing down. Daniel, ever the public figure, had begun to feel the weight of his own visibility. His name was now associated with not only boxing but also money laundering, real estate deals, and more. His carefully constructed legitimate persona was now in jeopardy. He had spent years cultivating relationships with politicians, business leaders, and even celebrities, all to keep the Kinahan Empire's name untouchable. But now, those relationships were becoming liabilities. The closer Daniel moved to the public eye, the more impossible it became to distance himself from the Empire's illegal operations. And as law enforcement tightened its grip, every handshake, every business deal, was coming under scrutiny. Christopher Jr., meanwhile, continued his work behind the scenes, but he knew that his days of managing the Empire quietly were numbered. His digital fortress was crumbling. The tools that had once given the Kinahans a competitive edge were now being used against them. While Christopher had always been able to predict and control everything from money flows to product movements, now, even the smallest misstep could lead to their downfall. In their desperation, the brothers made a bold decision: they would expand even further. They would create new routes, new markets, and new opportunities for revenue. But this was no longer about making money. This was about survival. They needed to secure their empire's future, and they knew that the old ways, secrecy, quiet manipulation, and strategic withdrawals, would no longer be enough. In the Middle East, a new deal was struck with a dangerous faction. Daniel and Christopher Jr. had always been cautious about getting too close to volatile regions, but desperation had forced their hand. They began shifting large shipments of drugs and weapons through undisclosed channels in Africa and the Middle East. The idea was simple: get out of Europe, where they had grown too visible, and into markets where they could operate under a different set of rules. But it wasn't just about new markets. It was about creating a labyrinth, a complex web of operations that would be too tangled for law enforcement to unravel. But as they made these moves, they were no longer operating with the same finesse they once had. Every decision they made carried more risk, and the stakes were higher than ever. As the brothers tried to protect their empire, they realized that they were losing control over the very thing they had worked so hard to build. The empire wasn't just a business, it was a life. It was their father's legacy, and now it was on the verge of collapse. Despite their best efforts, the threat of exposure was closer than ever. Rival cartels were beginning to make inroads into their territory. As the Kinahans sought to expand their operations, they were now fighting a multi-front battle against law enforcement, against other criminal organizations, and against their own growing paranoia. The empire that Christy had founded on patience and silence was now being tested by forces beyond their control. The question was no longer whether they could continue to operate, it was whether they could survive the coming storm. As law enforcement closed in, and the empire became more fractured by betrayal, Daniel and Christopher Jr. knew that their options were running out. The Kinahans had survived many challenges, but this one felt different. It was no longer a battle for dominance, it was a battle for survival. As the days grew darker, the brothers were faced with an agonizing reality. No matter how much they tried to hold on to the legacy, the empire Christy had built was slipping away, piece by piece. And in this game of power, there was only one certainty: the past was never truly gone. What had been built in silence and shadows was now being torn apart by the very forces Christy had tried to avoid. The empire was crumbling, and the brothers were running out of time. By 2020, the Kinahan Empire, once a shadowy force at the helm of Europe's criminal underworld, had entered a perilous phase. Daniel and Christopher Jr. had spent the last decade trying to keep the empire intact, but the forces arrayed against them were insurmountable. Law enforcement had begun closing in with coordinated operations across Europe, backed by intelligence sharing and new technologies that made it harder to stay hidden. Rival cartels were taking advantage of the Kinahans' growing weaknesses, and old enemies, some long buried, were starting to resurface, eager to challenge the empire's hold on the streets. For Daniel, the public-facing side of the empire had become impossible to manage. His involvement in legitimate businesses, boxing promotions, real estate ventures, and high-end investments had placed him squarely under the spotlight. Once, his visibility had been an asset. It had kept the Kinahans out of the direct focus of law enforcement, allowing them to operate in the shadows. But now, every business deal, every press conference, and every public appearance was an invitation for scrutiny. What had once been a careful dance between legitimacy and illegitimacy was now a tightrope walk that threatened to snap at any moment. Christopher Jr., who had kept to the shadows for most of his life, now found himself facing the limits of his carefully constructed empire. The digital fortress he had built to protect their operations was being tested like never before. What had once been an invisible, untouchable system was now under attack. Cybersecurity was more advanced than ever, but law enforcement had begun to exploit vulnerabilities in ways Christopher Jr. hadn't anticipated. Cryptocurrencies, once their greatest tool, were now being tracked by forensic investigators who had become far more adept at tracing illicit flows of money. Every encrypted transaction was a potential leak, and with every passing day, their operations were becoming harder to manage. Rival cartels, sensing the Kinahans' vulnerability, were pushing in. The Russians, the Albanians, and even more ruthless factions from South America were all vying for the Kinahan territory. The brothers had always relied on their silent power, on the ability to stay invisible, but as the world became more connected and their empire more visible, that strategy was no longer enough. The Kinahans were no longer the ghost kingpins of Europe, they were fighting for their lives. Internally, the cracks that had formed years earlier were beginning to show their true damage. Betrayals within their ranks, once a whisper in the dark, had become full-blown fractures. The men who had once sworn loyalty to Christy and the empire now saw their involvement as a liability. Old associates had grown tired of working in the shadows, and the loyalty that had once been the backbone of the Kinahan network was now in question. As rivals closed in, and the law began tightening its grip, the family members who had once been the empire's closest allies were now uncertain if they could trust each other. The old guard was beginning to fracture under the pressure, and the brothers found themselves struggling to keep their allies from breaking away. For the Kinahan brothers, it was becoming clear, the empire was collapsing under the weight of its own ambition. The world they had built, a world of quiet power, of shadows and whispered names, was no longer a world they could survive in. Law enforcement, rival cartels, and even their own men were closing in. The Kinahans had spent years perfecting a system that allowed them to operate without detection, but that system had become their prison. The empire that Christy had so carefully constructed was now slipping through their fingers. With no options left, the brothers began to make plans for the unthinkable. It was time to disappear, just as their father had done. But this time, it wouldn't be as simple as vanishing into the shadows. The empire Christy had built was too vast, too connected. The brothers would have to burn bridges, betray old allies, and make a final, desperate push to secure what little remained of the empire. Christopher Jr. began looking into places where they could take the remnants of their operations, far away from Europe, where the law had become a relentless enemy. Daniel, always the face of the operation, began to quietly sever ties with his legitimate businesses, knowing that any trace of the Kinahan name would be dangerous in the coming months. They knew that their days in Europe were numbered, and that any attempt to hold on to the empire would come at a price. But as they made plans to move the operation elsewhere, they were already too late. Law enforcement was closing in with unprecedented force. Interpol, working with European authorities, had launched a full-scale investigation into the Kinahans, using the vast network of intelligence agencies at their disposal. The final blow came when Daniel was linked directly to the cartel's operations in Spain. an arrest warrant was issued for him, and the Kinahan name became synonymous with the criminal syndicate that had once ruled Europe's underworld. Christopher Jr. had already begun moving the last of their assets when the final wave of raids hit. Law enforcement had finally traced the financial networks, following the trail of money that Christopher Jr. had once thought untraceable. The empire, once a ghost in the shadows, was now exposed to the world. The Kinahans were no longer kings of the underworld, they were fugitives on the run. As the brothers faced the collapse of everything Christy had built, they realized the true cost of their father's empire. It wasn't just the loss of wealth or power. It was the toll it took on them, on their relationships, their trust, and their very identities. Christy's empire had been built on secrets and lies, and now, as the brothers ran to stay one step ahead, they found themselves trapped in the very world they had inherited. By 2022, the Kinahan Empire, once the pinnacle of power and secrecy, was hanging by a thread. The empire that Christy Kinahan had carefully constructed, an empire built on silence, strategy, and patience, was now exposed for the world to see. Law enforcement agencies across Europe had launched an all-out assault on the Kinahan network, coordinating efforts through Europol, Interpol, and national forces. For the first time in decades, the Kinahan brothers, Daniel and Christopher Jr., found themselves cornered by the very system they had so expertly avoided. Daniel, the face of the Kinahan family, had spent years building his public image. His involvement in legitimate businesses, sports, and international ventures had all been carefully curated to keep the Kinahans untouchable. But as the investigation into the Kinahan cartel deepened, the cracks in his carefully constructed facade became glaringly obvious. Law enforcement had connected the dots between his legitimate enterprises and the illicit operations he had long kept hidden. The once sophisticated balance between his public life and criminal empire had shattered, and the Kinahan name was now linked to a global criminal syndicate. Christopher Jr., the quiet mastermind behind the empire's digital infrastructure, was no longer able to keep their operations hidden. He had built intricate systems of encryption, digital currencies, and offshore networks to keep the Kinahans ahead of the law. But as the digital age advanced, so did the tactics of law enforcement. What had once been their greatest asset, untraceable systems, was now their greatest liability. The police were using cutting-edge technology to track the flow of money, uncover hidden assets, and break through the digital fortresses that had once kept them safe. Their most sophisticated methods were now being used against them. Rival cartels, seeing the Kinahans' weakening position, began to move in. The Albanians, the Russians, and new players from the Middle East saw an opportunity to seize the Kinahan territory, and they weren't going to wait for the empire to collapse on its own. What had once been a carefully maintained network of power and influence was now the target of every criminal faction looking to fill the void left by the Kinahans. But it wasn't just the outside forces closing in, it was the betrayal from within their ranks that truly shook the foundation of the empire. Longtime allies, once loyal to Christy and his family, began to turn on the brothers. Those who had helped build the empire now saw the Kinahans as a sinking ship. In the world of organized crime, loyalty was a fragile commodity, and when the empire's power began to wane, the very people who had helped create it started to view their continued association with the Kinahans as more of a liability than an asset. The brothers were forced to make a desperate decision. With law enforcement closing in on all fronts, their rivals circling like vultures, and their own network fracturing from the inside, Daniel and Christopher Jr. realized that their survival depended on one last, final move, to disappear. But even this wasn't as simple as it seemed. The empire they had inherited from Christy had spread far and wide, leaving trails that were impossible to erase. Every safe house, every secret account, and every hidden route was now compromised. Christopher Jr., the silent architect, began to work furiously behind the scenes to move as much of the empire's assets as possible, trying to liquidate what they could before the authorities moved in. He had long known that their operation was vulnerable to a massive takedown, but even his genius could not prevent the inevitable. The digital systems he had spent years perfecting were now unraveling before his eyes. With every move, the brothers were running out of time and resources. They had built an empire based on secrecy, but now it was collapsing in full view of the law. In a final attempt to evade capture, Daniel and Christopher Jr. began moving across borders, trying to find safe havens where they could regroup and lay low. But every attempt to escape the net tightening around them only brought more attention. Rivals, sensing weakness, began to make their own moves, attacks on their remaining properties, attempts to wrest control of key territories, and offers of deals with law enforcement to bring the brothers down. In the end, it wasn't just law enforcement or rival cartels that brought the Kinahans to their knees. It was the very system they had built, the network of secrecy, loyalty, and control, that had finally betrayed them. The empire that Christy had constructed, built on shadows and silence, was now exposed, fragmented, and on the verge of total collapse. The Kinahans had once been untouchable, a name feared and whispered in the underworld. But as the dust settled and the final pieces of their empire crumbled, it was clear that the legacy of Christy Kinahan, the ghost Kingpin, was no longer a symbol of invincibility. The empire he had built on a foundation of secrecy and strategy had been destroyed, not by force, but by time, by technology, and by betrayal. As the brothers faced the consequences of their empire's collapse, they were left with only one question: could they survive this final downfall, or was this the end of the Kinahan legacy? By 2023, the Kinahan Empire was no more than a shadow of its former self. The power that Christy Kinahan had once wielded so quietly had been stripped away piece by piece, torn apart by the relentless forces of law enforcement, rival cartels, and internal betrayals. What had been built on years of secrecy, strategy, and cold patience had collapsed under the weight of modern technology, increasing scrutiny, and the very ambition that had driven Christy's empire in the first place. For Daniel and Christopher Jr., the end was inevitable. The brothers, who had spent years keeping the empire afloat, now found themselves trapped. The empire's far-reaching operations, once untouchable, had become the target of a global manhunt. The authorities had tracked their financial transactions, seized their properties, and infiltrated their networks. There was nowhere left to run. Daniel, the public face of the Kinahans, had once thrived on the visibility that came with his business ventures, but that same visibility now made him a prime target. The boxing promotions, the real estate deals, the legitimate businesses, each was now a link in the chain that bound him to the criminal empire. Every step he took was under the microscope. Daniel had tried to maintain a distance, to hold on to the illusion of legitimacy, but it was no longer possible. His name had become synonymous with the cartel, and the authorities were closing in with unmatched precision. Christopher Jr., the quiet strategist, had spent his life in the shadows, ensuring that the Kinahan operations continued to run smoothly. But even his brilliant systems were no longer enough. The digital infrastructure he had spent years building to protect their empire was falling apart. The encryption, the offshore accounts, the use of cryptocurrencies, all of it had become vulnerable to the advances in law enforcement technology. Christopher had always believed that information was power, but now, that information was being used against them. Their financial networks were being unraveled, their communications intercepted, and their assets seized. The brothers had one final plan: escape. But it was a plan that was becoming increasingly impossible to execute. Every route, every hiding place, every ally had already been compromised. The digital and physical traces they had left behind were too numerous to ignore. Law enforcement agencies around the world had coordinated their efforts, and the Kinahans were now being pursued relentlessly, from Europe to Africa to the Middle East. No matter how far the brothers traveled, no matter how many false identities they used, the noose was tightening. Even the remnants of their empire were slipping away. The few loyal associates who had once helped build the Kinahan name were either arrested or turned on them. Once valuable assets were being seized, properties were frozen, and the flow of money that had kept the empire running was now under constant surveillance. The brothers, once the kings of Europe's criminal world, were now fugitives, their empire a house of cards crumbling at their feet. Rival cartels, sensing the Kinahans' weakness, moved in to claim what was left. The power vacuum that had been created by the collapse of the Kinahan Empire was quickly filled by those who were more ruthless, more willing to use violence to claim control. The Albanians, the Russians, and even new players in the Middle East began carving up the territories that the Kinahans had once ruled with ease. The empire Christy had so carefully built was now being consumed by its enemies. In a last-ditch effort to save himself and his family, Daniel went underground. He went to ground, using the last of his resources to escape the relentless pursuit of law enforcement. But even then, he knew it was only a matter of time. The name Kinahan had become too toxic, too synonymous with crime, and there was no escaping the past. Christopher Jr., the quiet operator, was not far behind. He, too, knew that the game was up. He had done everything he could to keep the empire running, but the reality was undeniable: they had been outsmarted. The digital walls he had once so carefully constructed had come crashing down, and there was no escape. In the final days of the Kinahan Empire, as the authorities closed in on the last remnants of their operation, the brothers were forced to confront the inevitable. Their empire, built on power, secrecy, and manipulation, had come to an end. The very systems they had relied on to stay ahead of the law had been their undoing. The ghosts of Christy Kinahan's legacy were no longer in control. The empire was finished. The story of the Kinahans, once the most powerful crime family in Europe, ended in exile and imprisonment. The empire that Christy had built with his mind, his patience, and his strategic brilliance had collapsed under the weight of its own ambition. And as Daniel and Christopher Jr. disappeared into the shadows, their names would be remembered, but not as they had once hoped. They had become just another cautionary tale of a family that rose to the top only to fall, not through force, but through time, betrayal, and their own inability to adapt to a world that was changing faster than they could ever have imagined. The Kinahan Empire is no more. If you've followed the rise and fall of one of the most infamous criminal families in Europe, don't forget to comment below, like, and subscribe. This has been the story of Christy Kinahan and his sons, the legacy of a family that once ruled in the shadows, now nothing more than a name in history.